Europe Chief for Voice of America, relatively new position, because finally Voice of America decided to actually establish something in Eastern Europe in many, many years, after closing its office in Moscow. Why I'm talking about it, because a little personal story to start. Growing up in Soviet Union, I always knew you cannot speak outside about what are your parents talking at the dinner table. And you don't believe in news that are coming out from official sources and from television. But under the cover of the night, I would go to bed, and my dad would turn on a radio around 11, 12. And I would hear the weird sounds that I didn't understand. This is Voice of America from Washington. And that's where we were getting information. So it is very, very important to, as we know now, to get a proper, truthful, and factual information. Because unfortunately, in the last 2 or 3 decades after the collapse of Soviet Union, I feel that the Western world, and specifically United States, was drawn from this information warfare, giving the truthful information to specifically to our region. So, to examine the issue and to see the methods, our own strengths and vulnerabilities in this issue, we have a fantastic group of people. Jimmy Fly, my colleague from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Shota, Gvineria from EPRC. Laura Thompson from General Marshall Fund. Brian Whitmore from Atlantic Council. And Stefan Meister from German Council of Foreign Relations. Welcome, everybody. So, my first question would be to you, Jimmy, because that's what I started with this issue, that somehow, after the end of Cold War, we somehow believed that this is the end, and we can actually, the nations would become democratic in one day, and we don't need to do anything. And basically, we start closing on our information operation in Europe, one by country, one by one, and withdrawing resources. Jimmy, tell me, what was the problem? Why we didn't understand? And what can we do today to kind of came back and fight this disinformation?
Great, sure. I'm happy to start off by tackling that. I just want to thank the organizers for inviting all of us. It's great to be back at the forum after a couple years away during the pandemic. And I'm very happy to be on this panel with Myroslava, my colleague from VOA. And Myroslava said her family was listening to VOA. My guess is they were also listening to Radio Liberty, and maybe she just doesn't want to say that. So VOA gets all the budget resources from the Congress. But I hear many stories from people throughout the region who heard the voices in the night, and especially now, people who were children and their families were huddled around the radio, turning the dial, trying to find what frequency VOA's broadcasts were on, our broadcasts were on. It was a powerful tool for many decades. I think, we witnessed this firsthand at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. In the 90s, there was a debate in Congress about shutting us down, and there were very prominent senators and members of Congress who were convinced that our mission was finished. There was no need for the United States government to invest in information, that the wave of democracy would handle the rest. And I like to say today that really the 2 individuals who saved at least Radio Free Europe were Václav Havel, who invited us to move from our increasingly expensive location in Munich and came to the US government and said, please, I believe in this organization. I experienced firsthand its role in the events leading up to the Velvet Revolution. Come to the front lines of freedom in Prague. And the US government thankfully took him up on that offer and saved a lot of money along the way. But the other person actually was in the U.S. Senate. It was then Senator Joe Biden, who gave several speeches on the floor of the Senate about the power of U.S. international broadcasting, about the power of VOA and RFE. And then he and his team wrote the International Broadcasting Act, which still governs our operations to this day. And I'm very thankful that we were able to continue playing an important role. I think the challenge that we've faced is that as we made it through that moment and survived, we also expanded. We went out into the field. We set up bureaus across the region, became known for surrogate journalism on the ground, and that was quite effective. But we also, because of budget pressures, attention shifting elsewhere, we also stopped services. We got out of certain markets because we decided that our work was done. And at least over the last 3 years that I've been involved, the challenge now is we're getting drawn back in. And so we've actually returned to markets that we had once felt were fully flourishing media markets. 3 years ago, we relaunched our Romanian and Bulgarian language content. 2 years ago, we returned to Hungary. And when I talk to some of our funders in the US Congress, I often get another list of new markets that they want us to go back into. And I think there's a realization that maybe we cut back far too early, and now is a moment where independent, truthful information is needed more than ever. And so I think we just need to keep on sustaining it, funding it, and making sure that we're adaptable for the new challenges that we're facing. I'm sure we'll talk about some of those challenges later in the panel.
While we were withdrawing, like US and West were withdrawing, Russia were coming in big way. And another story, a little story that I remember because I came to United States in 2001, and I remember I turned on TV a couple of years after that, maybe 2003, 2004, and it was channel MHZ in DC, and I'm seeing Russia Today on the channel. And my hair stood up. I was like, this is not happening. And nobody were talking about it. It was a norm because we are a free society. We allow every voice to be heard. I want to turn to Stefan. Please tell us, what are our own vulnerabilities and why are we allowed those propaganda voices on our TV channels?
Thank you. Is it working? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me again to this conference. I'm really happy to be also back to Tbilisi, and yeah, it's always a pleasure here also to engage with the US colleagues, with the European colleagues, and with the Georgian and regional colleagues. We are all, I think we discussed this before, we're all a little bit tired also to talk about disinformation, information warfare. It has become such a big topic. Everybody is somehow working on it, but I think it's really important not to be tired on it, yeah, because I think it's going on, it's upgrading, and I think it is also about the vulnerabilities of open societies. As you already said, I think we have a public discourse where decision makers have to react. If you have an energy crisis, if you have a social crisis, yeah, because of economic changes globally, our decision makers have to respond to this, and they are very, very careful. In Russia, you can operate the public discussion, yeah, and I think that's very different, and I think that creates also entry points, but I think it's also about learning how to deal with it and reacting to it. And I think for me a key problem, if I'm looking to German but also European foreign policy, I think it's very much a bureaucratic process. It's not a strategic process. So it's very much about bureaucracy, but not about strategies. And I think we are very slow also in reacting to new narratives. We are slow in reacting to lies also, which are coming from the top. Yeah, I think we have to say also that the main agents of disinformation in Russia are also top politicians, yeah, including the foreign minister, and yeah, and I think if we remember the whole nuclear blackmailing, yeah, which is something which works very well in European societies, that's part of a disinformation campaign. And we just had the ambassadors conference in Berlin where the German foreign minister Baerbock was saying to the ambassadors, you have to be more outspoken. You have to reach out more in the countries where you are and to speak more about what is our policy, but also to react to lies of others. I think that's really against the DNA of the German diplomatic service, but I think that's a reaction to the world in which we are. I think another problem, what I see, is that we are still talking very much in bubbles. We are often in circles which just confirm our own narratives, but we don't reach beyond this bubble. When I'm leaving Berlin, the Berlin bubble, going to Eastern Germany or going to other parts of Germany or in Europe in regions, and I want to talk about Russia and Russian disinformation, for instance, people ask me about the US. So there's a strong anti-Americanism in our societies. And if I'm talking in my Berlin bubble, I don't see this. If I'm talking to normal people, I'm really shocked. I'm always saying I'm not a US expert, I'm a Russia expert, so I cannot talk about this, and this is not a topic here. But I think who is facing this kind of anti-American narratives? There are a lot of pro-Russian sentiments in the society. It's identity questions also for many people, and I don't see the responsible politicians who are dealing with this, who are facing this, who are reaching out to do this. And I think we also as experts have to reach out. Journalists, also working with journalists on these topics. I remember very well when in 2012, 2014, then 2013 and 14, nobody was interested in disinformation. It was something which was somehow came out of the blue, and I was trying to work on this more systematically, also show, especially in Russia, how it has developed inside of Russia, how it was spreading then also to the post-Soviet countries, and then entering also into Europe. And then also we were discussing the agents of Russian disinformation in our societies, former politicians, right-wing and left-wing populists, and it took so much time to catch up, to understand what is this about, that I think that's really a major vulnerability for me to react to new things which are not so new, and the only way to bring it to the attention was working with journalists, working with investigative journalists, working with those who are directly also engaged in this, just to create awareness among decision makers. Yeah.
In some way, one of the vulnerability that we have, again, it's our strengths and vulnerability about the freedom of the speech, and that's what I wanted to ask about. We are allowing these voices, and we are allowing social media platforms to spread this disinformation. Social media platforms that actually created in the West. I want to turn to Brian. We as well have our own stories to tell. What kind of stories do we have about today's war, and what do we believe in?
Thank you, Myroslava. Am I turned on? Okay. Thank you, Myroslava, and it's great to be appearing at a panel with you again. I feel we appear together so many times we could probably finish each other's sentences. I also want to thank the organizers, David, Evelyn, and Nino. It's truly an honor to be here. We've been admiring this problem in the immortal words of Ambassador Daniel Fried for many years now. And what I want to try to do in my time here is to reframe it. To reframe it away from thinking about it as an information war, but as a battle of stories, a storytelling battle. Because storytelling is central to being human. It's actually the human race's ability to tell stories that enabled mass cooperation, which made society possible, right? I mean, made things as banal as money possible, right? Without the story of money, believing that it has value, money is just a piece of paper with a picture of a famous dead person on it. That's it. But when you believe it has value, then it does, and you can use it to buy things, to invest in things. So storytelling is central. And the story that Western civilization has been telling itself for centuries is an extraordinarily powerful story. The story that individuals have rights, that those rights are sacrosanct, that the consent of the governed is the only thing that legitimizes government, that diverse, multiracial, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic societies can indeed balance liberty and equality. This is a very, very powerful story. But the problem is, in recent years, many of us have stopped believing the story. Many of us have questioned the story. And then we are subject to the virus of disinformation. I mean, think of believing in your story. Believing in our Western story is like the vaccine that protects us against all variants, including Omicron and Delta. If we don't believe the story, we are out there and we are unvaccinated. And this is what's happening right now. And this is happening as our Western story is being challenged by another story, by a power to the east, or at least from where we're sitting now, a power to the north. But you know whom I'm talking about. I mean, they're telling a different story. They're telling a story that it's a dangerous world out there, and we need strong patrimonial states to protect us, that multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multiracial, and multi-ethnic states are unstable, that freedom leads to chaos, and that we need a strong patrimonial leader to protect us. This story is challenging our story right now. Now, what I want to bring this around to is I do want to bring this around to Ukraine. Because I believe right now, for many reasons, we owe a very, very great debt of gratitude to the Ukrainians. Because they are reviving our story. And then what I want to do in my remaining time is look at 3 ways that the Ukrainians are reviving our faith in the Western story. Because as we in the West are questioning the efficacy of our Western story, our liberal democratic story, the Ukrainians right now, at this minute, are fighting and dying for it. And this should tell us that this story is worth fighting for. It's easy for us to take for granted what we've had. But when you have to fight and die for this, and we're watching Ukrainians fight and die for this right now, this is reviving, I think, should be reviving our faith in the Western story. It's certainly revived mine. The second fallacy that the Ukrainians are debunking right now with their actions, and this is also a central part of the Western story, is the sovereignty and independence of small states is as important and as sacrosanct as the sovereignty and independence of great powers. The story that's been coming out of Moscow is that the world is made up of great powers who have agency, Russia, the United States, China, and that's about it. Let's face it, that's it. Everybody else are just pawns with no agency. Well, the Ukrainians are speaking loud and clear right now and telling us we have agency. And they are proving that they have agency on the battlefield. The third thing that the Ukrainians are doing for us right now that I think is really, really important is reviving the faith in civic patriotism. I mean, think about Ukraine. The president of Ukraine that is leading them against this war in Russia is a Russian-speaking Jewish man. Again, notwithstanding the propaganda coming out of the Kremlin that Ukraine is run by fascists. It's got to be the strangest fascist junta in the history of the world. The person who started the Euromaidan uprising, who posted on Facebook famously, Mustafa, was an Afghan immigrant, Ukrainian citizen. Ukraine is creating this model of civic patriotism and civic nationalism, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional civic patriotism that is competing with this ethno-nationalism that is emanating from Moscow. So these are 3 ways that I believe that the Ukrainians, and we really owe the Ukrainians so much for what they are giving us right now. They're saving us from ourselves in many ways, even as they're saving themselves. Thank you.
This is very interesting because Ukraine, in generally fighting this war, actually debunking myth as well that Russia is the Russians' army are the strongest army in the world. Yeah. That it's impossible to fight Russians. So this is one of the stories that we in the West were telling ourselves as well. Ukraine or Kiev will fall in 2 days. Ukraine doesn't have a chance to withstand Russia. It's not true. And we have this proven right now in the last 6 months. However, the story is very, very important. And I want to turn to Laura. You do a lot of research. And talking about, Brian talked about, Stefan talked about bubbles. We do live in our bubble. What kind of stories are heard in, let's say, Latin America or Africa, it's probably a different story.
That's right. And first of all, I just want to, once again, thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. I've been coming to this conference since its beginning in 2015 because I was living here in Georgia. So it's a pleasure to actually fly back here and attend as an expat. Yes, I think that actually Brian sort of stole my thunder in some ways because...
Sorry.
Yeah, as usual. But no, I think that what we learned from Ukraine is, and which is leading to your question, are sort of the 3 Ps that I talk about in the work that I do, which is preempt, prebunk, predict. So it wasn't even so much debunking mythology, but getting out in front of it. And I think what we have to do so much is play offense. And one thing that we've had to learn from our adversaries is that they're excellent at that. And this isn't new, they've just been sharpening their tools. And I think it's really important, and in our research, we make sure that we look at information operations through the lens of the entire autocratic toolkit. It's not alone. It operates in tandem with malign finance. It operates in tandem with economic coercion, with cyber interference. And importantly, what we're seeing is we can't separate it from, for example, technology exports. So we see, for example, the cables, the telecommunications, the software, the apps that are being exported are a lubricant for information operations. What we've also seen, and something that we can learn from, is our adversaries, while they absolutely, I agree with the comments yesterday, they don't necessarily share the same long-term or maybe even short-term goals. They do share tactics. They learn from one another, they copy one another. I'm happy to talk about how we've been tracking how the PRC is sort of mimicking Kremlin approaches and tactics. And the other thing that our adversaries have learned, and something that we can learn from to defend ourselves, is that they play upon our own weaknesses. And we know well that the call is coming from inside the house. So there's very little for them to do in some cases. As we've seen in my country, the United States, you just light a match. We just launched a US midterms elections dashboard, and I checked it this morning, and in just a week, there are 600,000 data points from the Kremlin on narratives that are all domestic American narratives, almost entirely focused on the big lie, elections can't be trusted in the United States, the 2020 elections were illegitimate. So they didn't have to create that narrative, it existed, and they just inflamed it. And they've also, I think we've learned, that trying to approach too much on the supply side is a little bit like squeezing a water balloon. And I'm not saying that I am against the bans of RT and Sputnik in Europe, but one thing we learned by looking at the French elections was, while yes, of course, RT and Sputnik were limited, bad information finds a way. So we saw it going through diplomatic accounts, we saw it going through useful idiots, we saw it going through personal accounts. And we also saw their ability to use other news sites, like in the Spanish language world. Ahi Lesva is just exploding. It is really hard to tell that it's a Russian state-backed. It's very creative, it's TikToks, it's videos, it's humor, and it's taking off. So what do we learn from that? I think, again, coming back to our Ukrainian friends, is playing the offense and focusing on those stories. And I just wanted to give you a little example from Georgia, because when I lived here and I was working for NDI, we actually experimented with preemptive messaging. And we did a survey of the entire country. We had control and treatment groups. And for the treatment group, we just fed information about Georgia's narrative. But we also fed factual information about Russia versus Europe and the United States, like life expectancy, levels of domestic violence, et cetera. And we found, and statistically and scientifically proved, that this actually did move the needle. That even just this little intervention of just providing these stories, as you say, actually changed public opinion. I mean, it was a little, but imagine what you could do at scale. So I think, and then I'll end here, you know, when you talk about stories, you come back to the demand side, which is, I think, where we need to be. And we can talk about regulations, and we can talk about advancing our predictive capacity. But at the end of the day, we also have a demand problem. And particularly in some countries, including my own, we have this peculiar combination of gullibility and cynicism, right? We're gullible in that we can believe sometimes crazy, outlandish things. And we're cynical in the sense that we believe everyone lies and the whole system is corrupt. And so I think we have to get beyond just trying to beat this with logic and trying to beat this with, the facts and think that that's going to fix it. And we need to focus as much on hearts as minds. And then I circle back to what Brian said, that's where the stories come in. But it's also getting at that sort of resilience of the public. And Shota and I have spent a lot of time talking about how do you build that? How do you recreate a belief that when trust has been so eroded? And I think a lot of it, and I'll end here, I promise, is that it also requires some political courage on the part of our leaders. Because unfortunately, we see bad information coming from leadership. And so we also need to see leaders, and I point to McCain as one of these people that stood up against a very maybe politically advantageous narrative. Obama was a Muslim and and that's terrible. And he stood up and he countered it. And we need to see that kind of leadership, even if it's politically advantageous to sell a lie. And it's really good to rile up your base. You got to stand above it.
Thank you very much. And I want to go back to Ukrainian issue. And some of this information warfare was even effective from the Western side. And I want to ask Shota, what have you seen worked effectively, specifically in this time of war?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I think we have to remind ourselves more frequently that these information campaigns and information operations are means to the end and not vice versa. So the storytelling component that Brian unpacked so skillfully is just one part of it, and it is inherently linked with the policy. So what is the end that we're trying to achieve through these information campaigns? That's the political objectives. We have different tools in the toolbox, right? The instruments of national power. And why has information become such an important tool in today's 21st century security environment? Because after the emergence of the cyberspace, the way we create, store, move, and manipulate with information is entirely digitalized. It is happening in the cyberspace, and it has changed the way we use all the other instruments of national power. And it actually, the reach and the effect of the informational tool is enormous. And you can actually get influences through those tools, and this is a very important thing. And I think that what happened in Ukraine is a very good proof of what I'm trying to say here, because if we, on one hand, try to pin down what was the West doing in the information, let's say, ecosystem before the war started. The message was from the, I was attending a conference in Warsaw, and there was the bureaucrat from EU sitting right next to me at the panel, and I've heard that the policy actually of the European Union is to avoid conflict at all costs. Avoid conflict at all costs. And then we have been hearing for too long, also from the United States, from NATO high officials, that actually we will defend every inch of NATO's territory, which actually means that we're not going to defend anything else. And even before, when it was a big talk and issue about the perspective, it was a big talk about the membership action plan. We were saying on one hand that yes, these countries in this region are part of the free world, but on the other hand, we're not giving a proper message to Russians what will happen in case they invade those countries. And basically, what I think was one of the main components of what Russia did on February 24 was because they were convinced that there was not going to be the response nowhere close to what we see now. If Putin had seen this, what is going on now, in his worst nightmare, I'm sure he would not have come close to Ukraine at all. But because we communicated, the West communicated, not in the very, let's say, accurate and understandable way for Putin, he miscalculated and we're here where we are. But now let's look at it from the other side. Okay? So again, back to the influences. Let's start from September 2021. There was the Zapad exercise. For the first time, we have seen in this scenario nuking the NATO member state and occupying actually the territory of the NATO member state. That was immediately reinforced through the migration crisis. It was reinforced again through the gas prices and oil prices, the crisis there in that area. And only then Russia started to build its military presence around Ukraine. And it started to bring this military capability. It was sort of their way of building this blackmailing, let's say, tool and saying, okay, guys. And now it culminated in the ultimatums. Here we come to the information part of all this, right? Black on white, Putin told us that actually if the West is not ready to roll back to the arrangements that we had in '97, then we will start the war. And he was convinced that this blackmail would work because it would work every time before that, and back to the policy of avoiding conflict at all costs. You know, he knew that. He thought that probably it's going to work this time as well. And when this did not work, actually we saw that his strategy was falling apart. There was nothing they can do on the ground. But what determined what we are seeing today as the success of Ukraine and strategic failure of Russia has started again with the information domain. Well, when the United States started to leak real-time intelligence, telling the world about the intentions of Putin, the locations and numbers of their troops and equipment, this is when they got lost. They realized that they lost information warfare, thus they lost the blackmailing capabilities, thus they had to start acting on the ground and they couldn't. And that's the moment for me to remind ourselves that the storytelling is one part, but information is a strategic capability, and unless it's the part of a planning process, it's a strategic planning process. And unless we look at it the way, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, and this is why we're doing all this, then this can be effective.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to actually add to that effective tools. President Zelensky himself is a very effective tool in this information warfare. His communication skills, he used very well to actually persuade the world that Ukraine will win. And he persuaded his own, Ukrainians, they don't need to be persuaded to fight for their country, but the world had to believe in Ukraine that it's possible that Ukraine can withstand. So he was one of the effective tools as well. I want to switch the topic a little bit because there are a lot of discussion about is it possible to change Russians' mind. And for years and years and years, we put a lot of money trying to convince or give Russians truthful information. I'm not sure we were effective in that operation. And the question is why? I would like to turn to Jimmy. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And what can we do differently? And is it even possible to change the minds of Russians?
Sure, and I'll pick up on a couple of the good points that have been raised. I mean, I think I was thinking back 3 years ago to this conference, and I think we had a similar panel then. I don't remember the exact framing, but we probably were debating, are we winning, are we losing? I mean, I've always been candid, even as head of RFE. I think we've been winning the information battle we've been losing the information battle for quite some time. The Kremlin's been winning. The last 6 months, though, I'll say, actually things have shifted. And while I can't say we're winning now, I think momentum is on our side for the first time in many years. And so I guess we're just maybe losing less badly than we were before, maybe 3 years ago. But still, that's progress and something that we should take advantage of. I mean, I actually think part of the reason that we're seeing increased success since the war started is what Brian raised, and as a former RFE employee, he might still be listening into our editorial conversations, but it's all about storytelling. It's about the content that you make available, about drawing audiences in, and it exploits a weakness in the Kremlin's approach, because the Kremlin messaging doesn't really give the average Russian a sense that they have agency over anything. It's not about them at all. It usually ignores them. It's more about tearing them down and confusing them and spreading rumors and conspiracy theories, and it's the same tactics we see in the US and in other democracies, and same tactics they and political actors here also deploy. And so when you can empower people by touching on issues that they truly care about, that affect their families, that affect their lives, that's where we see the audience response. And that's mostly what we've been doing with our coverage of the war. We have 150 people on the ground in Ukraine. We're on all fronts. We're covering the front lines, but we're also scattered across the country, just covering the impact of the war on Ukrainians' day-to-day lives. And when you do storytelling well, you, the journalist, are often in the shadows, letting the person you're interviewing speak to the camera now, especially if you're doing video products. And some of our most compelling coverage that has been incredibly popular inside Russia is when we give the mic to a Ukrainian family and let them talk about how this war has affected them. Some heartbreaking stories we've done profiling Russian-speaking Ukrainians from the East, a father who lost his entire family in shelling, where he kind of pleads to the camera, why us? We're Russian speakers. I'm part in the broader cultural mindset of Russia. Why would I be targeted in this way? So that's the sort of reporting that we're doing, and I am more optimistic. I know this is not a popular view inside Ukraine. I've talked to our Ukrainian staff about it. I've talked to you, the Zelensky team, about it. There's a sense right now in Ukraine that it's not worth trying anymore. We're never going to convert them. We see people, because of the interest that they've shown in our content, there's still hunger for factual information about what is going on in the world outside Russia. We still do on-the-street interviews in Russia, and yes, you get plenty of people who will spout last night's talk show propaganda at the camera, and it's a minority, but there are still brave Russians of all ages who will look at a camera that they know is recording video that will go online, where their faces will not be masked, and they will insult Putin. They will say this war is a failure. Why are we now isolated from the world? We want a different future for ourselves. And so those individuals are there. They're probably not out protesting every day because they know that they'll get thrown in prison immediately, but they are still there. They still are hungry for independent information. And I think given our history, we're still ultimately hopeful that more and more people will begin to feel that way and seek out independent information over time as the long-term consequences of this war become more apparent to them. Because that, ultimately, I think, is the power that Putin has right now. He has successfully been able to shield a significant portion of the Russian public from the fallout from this war, which has created the space for the Kremlin's propaganda to be successful. So I think it's clearly a work in progress. There's a lot more we need to do, but we need the resourcing, we need the support from governments to protect journalists when they come under pressure. But ultimately, I'm still optimistic that the truth will still win out in Russia. It's going to take a while.
Brian,
just 2 points.
yes,
just
absolutely.
really quickly.
Yeah.
We just to echo this, we set up at ASD, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, we set up a Yandex dashboard. And the point of the index dashboard is to track consumption within Russia and Russian-speaking communities. And it's interesting because it didn't turn up exactly what we anticipated. I mean, we had a bias towards, everyone's just, in their search engines, they're just only going to Russian state media sources, et cetera. It's a lot more, it's not so black and white. And we actually were really quite surprised that when Russians are using search engines and the terms they're searching up, we came across BBC, we came across CNN, search terms, Bucha massacre, people are trying to find out information about it. So it does indicate that there is some sort of nuance there, particularly in terms of domestic consumption in Russia.
You know Russia well. Do you agree that it is possible to change their minds?
I think it is, but it's going to be a long slog. And in response to Jamie, no, I'm not listening to RFE's editorial meetings, but I truly missed them because they were really formative for me. But Myroslava,
by the way, I worked for Radio Liberty for 4 years as well, so just FYI.
But to answer your question, Myroslava, as you were asking Jamie the very same question, I was thinking about one of my first experiences in the Soviet Union back in '91, and before the Soviet Union collapsed, and I was walking down Nevsky Prospect and stopped in front of Gostiny Dvor, which is in the center of Nevsky Prospect, where people used to post things on. There was a wall there where people would post kind of like political messages, and this is the early '90s. And my Russian language skills weren't the greatest then. They were very fledgling, I guess would be a kind way to put it. But I started reading a placard that was up there and trying to see if I could understand what was written. I started translating it, and it was, "We hold these truths to be self." It was the preamble to the United States Constitution, and my jaw dropped. And I asked the gentleman there, why do you have the preamble of the U.S. Constitution on a wall in Nevsky Prospect in the middle of what was still Leningrad? And he said, because this is what we aspire to. You have the greatest constitution in the world, and this is what we aspire to. Now, America has fallen a lot in the eyes of Russia since then for many, many reasons, but the fact that I could read that in what was still the USSR, in 1991, tells me that this is possible. That we can do this. It's going to be a longer, harder slog. I would argue this is not where we should be placing our efforts right now. We should be placing our efforts with the societies that have made this choice that they want to go west, and that is Ukraine, that is Georgia, that is Moldova. That should be our priority. The Russians should not be our priority, but we should not, at the end of the day, give up on them.
Thank you so much. And from this very important point, I would like to turn to the audience. I'm seeing David is waving for me. Ooh, okay, great. So let's do two, and then maybe two another. Please, identify yourself here.
Hello, I'm Vlad Galushka from the Open Society Foundations. I got two questions. I think one is probably for Jamie. How do you adapt to the digital age? Where media consumption is very different. People are not hovering around the radio, they're mostly online, and they have very limited attention span. And the second one, I think, builds on Myroslava's point about Ukraine's response. What do you think we can learn from Ukraine's government response, but also civil society response in terms of countering disinformation? Like the North Atlantic Fellas organization that is like a great meme group that's been countering Russian disinformation online in terms of kind of government statecraft against disinformation and malign influence. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Georg Gandelake with European Georgia. We had a poll here in May which showed that over 50% of Georgians say that a patriotic Georgian should be proud of Stalin. 66% say that Stalin's rule had both good and bad things in it. In the last 10 years, we have 11 new statues of Stalin. I think this is one, but sadly not the only example of how successful the Russian disinformation is, while a lot of the Western-backed efforts to counter that disinformation are confined to elite discourses and conference rooms such as this. To make things worse, a lot of those efforts are focused on analyzing each and every lie rather than supporting successful campaigns, even though those very reports show that policymakers in this country themselves are often sources of the Russian disinformation narratives. To make things even worse, Vladimir Putin himself, while he says that Soviet Union, the memory of the Soviet Union is the issue number one, very few of the efforts to counter disinformation deal with the Soviet Union. So the question would be perhaps even rhetorical. Do you not think that some sort of policy review is overdue in understanding what works pragmatically and what doesn't? Thank you.
Policy review
in Western capitals, in what is worth supporting and what isn't.
I think this would be a question to you, probably. So, Jimmy.
Yeah, on the digital transformation, I mean, this is our major, set aside all the wars and having to relocate journalists and being designated foreign agent and being fined $15 million by the Kremlin. What we really need to spend most of our time focused on, and we are, is on being as effective on digital platforms as possible. And every news organization that's going to succeed in the world is going through this. But it is a significant challenge. It's especially challenging for an organization that still has radio in its name, which confuses a lot of people. The reality is we actually do less and less radio, and in most markets, there are many of our markets now where we don't even do any radio at all. We don't do TV. We've pivoted beyond that to focus on social media. It's part structural, and I spent a lot of time talking to people with experience at other news organizations about how they've adapted. The sort of talent you need is changing in digital news. You need people with different skill sets. You need different types of training for your journalists. You need to make tough choices, which is difficult for any entity that receives government funding, because that tends to make you a little bit less flexible and adaptable. But in that market, I mean, we can be pushing out content on a social media platform that 6 months from now no one will remember, and they've moved on to the next hot social media platform, and we need to move along with them rather than chasing after the audience. So we're very focused on that. Actually, our work here with our Georgian service, Tbilisi, is a perfect example, I think, and we actually hold them up inside the company as an example of a service that made that pivot many years ago and is really now leading the way in a number of areas. For instance, I know TikTok is controversial in the US, but the reality is people around much of our region use it, especially young people. Here, they just were recognized internally for a lot of their TikTok videos, which are actually educational, but still entertaining. And so we're piloting projects like that, which then the Georgian service is now sharing with other services across the company. And so through all these ways, we're adapting. The final thing I'll just say about digital, which is fantastic from the company perspective, is you can actually measure your success. Radio, it's increasingly difficult to get any actual surveys about who listens to radio, what time of day they listen, why they listen, how long they listen. All of that data is pretty much at your fingertips when you put up a YouTube video or some sort of other social media platform. And so that allows you, getting back to the storytelling, to be much more effective with your storytelling, because you can tell what draws people in, what they respond to, what they turn away from. And so we're really incorporating all of that data into our operations. And one final optimistic note on Russia, we see it in the Russian data. My Ukrainian service came to me a couple months ago and said, Mr. President, we're seeing so much traffic to our Ukrainian page from Russia. Should we start thinking about our Russian audience? And I had to tell them, well, no, your job is to think about your Ukrainian audience. But Russians were coming to Ukrainian language content because they were hungry to hear and learn about the war. And that Ukrainian page was actually not blocked by the Russians. And so Russians just decided, I'll learn about the facts about what's happening in Ukraine by reading Ukrainian content. So we can see trends like that and identify audiences, which in the past, it would have taken months of survey work and polling to even get a rough estimate of who your audience is. And so it's a much more powerful situation for media companies now from that perspective.
Thank you very much. Since we heard about Radio Liberty, I have obligation to say something about VOA. Actually, Voice of America Ukrainian service is the most trusted international broadcaster in Ukraine. And we built a very, very effective, successful operation there. Since Ukrainian media it's very kind of hectic and difficult, and a lot of them are oligarchic owned. So people come to us for the factual information, and that's we grow our audience significantly as well as on social media and on television as well. On one note on your question about the effectiveness of Ukrainian operation, I think Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military actually started doing this Twitter, TikTok, little stories, and they are very humanizing. They're using like putting human voice, faces. I mean, soldiers, humanizing soldiers, telling the stories from the hearts, using I mean them. It's actually very effective, as well as they are using humor. And that works pretty well for Ukrainian, like to see Ukrainian army as a pleasant and strong and very resolute fighters. So about the policy.
Can I just react to one more point, because
Yes,
there was
I wanted
not
to
the
give some.
opportunity. No, I think the second point for me is also Ukrainian civil society, but also Ukrainian government. They have a positive narrative. We can win this war, and this is also about. This is our war, yeah. This is not only Ukrainian war, but this is about the West. This is about the free world. I think this is a very strong narrative, and it's really impressive that this works, because I think there is really the question why we lost the trust in the West. The West lost the trust in the West, yeah.
Yes.
And I think you said this right. Ukraine is reinventing this, yeah. We have also to say this is a Western bubble. I think there are other countries in the world who does not support this. But I think this is a very strong narrative, and it is a positive narrative. Russia has mostly a negative, a damaging narrative. I think I just wanted to add this. Just one second point. What we discussed before, I think the problem about facts, I think our leaders often discussing Russian disinformation from the top. We're taking this as a serious policy, what Mr. Putin, what Mr. Lavrov is saying, but that's part of the disinformation. And I think there is a lack of knowledge also, how Russian politics functions, also how Ukraine functions, but there's also a lack of knowledge to counter with facts by our decision makers, and they are just half-truths or just half knowledge often, which is the reaction to these lies which are there. And I think that's also how to inform better decision makers and prepare them better to counter these lies. And I would not agree with. I think we should concentrate on those who wants to integrate with Europe, who wants to integrate with transatlantic structures, who wants to change. But I also think we should working on the Russians in parallel. And I think that this is the success of the Russian disinformation since the end of the 19th, to destroy trust in media, to destroy trust in facts, and to have this conspiracy. And I think to work with the Russians who are now abroad, and they are smart people, to work also on the Russian-speaking information sphere. I think that's something we have to face. I think, and I think it's also part of our task. So now I'm coming to this question you wanted to ask me.
This is the gentleman wanted to ask.
Yeah, I know. This is, I mean, you both, yeah. Yes, I think sure we have to review the policy and also think about what priorities we set. How to say this? I think, we needed this war to wake up. And there were other signals before. Is it Georgia in 2008? Is it Ukraine in 2014? Which did not help to wake up. Yeah, and it needed this war. But what we saw was a disengagement in our neighborhood. What we saw, I speak about Europe. Yeah, what we saw was there was a geopolitical conflict, but we were not ready for it. I think we are now catching up in a way. And I agree. I think it needs maybe a prioritization. It needs also the question who has a European perspective. It is a geopolitical conflict which needs also geopolitical answers. But I'm not so sure if we are already really learning the lessons. I think think we are just adapting to this new reality, but the reality is already changing. Yeah, I talked about bureaucratic foreign policy. I don't see the mindset change, the strategic change. I just don't see that we are really adapting our systems. We're doing a lot of what would have been impossible before this war. And I think it's really a break of several taboos. But, you know, I think we are coming from the reality which is far behind the reality which was already there. And now this reality is further changing. And to adapt to this, and then taking over also an escalation dominance in a war with a country which will go beyond, which will never stop if you are not stop this country. We talked yesterday about we need to support Ukraine more, that they should win the war. But I think we all agree there is a consensus that we are not doing it in our decision-making circles, that we are not, we don't want to further escalate. And I think we have to take this also, we have to challenge this. We have to challenge that we are talking Ukraine should win, but we are not doing that Ukraine wins. Yeah, and then it's about Georgia. It's about European perspectives also for Moldova, for me also for Armenia, and I think it's the question: are we capable and able really to adapt to this reality?
We don't have a choice.
And I think the price will only grow. I think we only agree, and the price has already grown. But it's others are driving. Yeah, I don't. And it's the US who leads. Yeah, but also the US is very careful not to escalate it too far. Yeah. But we all agree: if Ukraine not wins this war, and Russia will not lose this war, then it's just going on. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions to offer, so please. One? Yes. Oh, actually, you first, because you had a word.
Thank you. Michał Baranowski, GMF Warsaw. I wanted to ask about specific kind of actor that is spreading misinformation, which is people in power in our countries. Here in Georgia, in my country, in Poland, Laura mentioned this, that we have problem not only with Russians, but actually our own people. How do we deal with that? Even though, of course, they often repeat Kremlin lines, whether they know it or not. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. And you? We have questions out there.
Hello, my name is Nick Alomidze. I work for the International Republican Institute. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. My question is about how do we monetize countering disinformation. For example, the North Atlantic Fellows Organization raised millions of dollars over the course of just a couple of months. So how do we encourage the, not the trolls, but the counter trolls, I forget the term for them. How do we encourage them to actually monetize their efforts?
I don't know. Okay, short answers. Who has short answers? You have, okay, go on.
And I think I will start from Vlad's excellent question about the role of the civil society. And here we have 2 very good textbook cases in Ukraine and Georgia, how civil society's role is inexplicably big in countering disinformation. And here in Georgia, it's a little bit different because, you know, as was mentioned in one of the questions, the government is on the wrong side of it. So if the information tool is trying to achieve increase of the influences, its influences on A, government's decisions and policies, and B, on public opinion. In democracies, it's of course very closely interlinked, but in the countries like Georgia, we see where the success of the informational pressure on the government have resulted in complete loss of ability to take actions and make decisions which they know will be not favored in Moscow and Kremlin. So we have lost this utterly. But what we see on the other hand in the civil society and among wider public is still very, very high support towards European course of Georgia. And despite, you know, the fact that there are negative trends in there, of course, the majority of the civil society and the population is standing very strong. despite the enormous pressure not only from the Russian disinformation machinery, which we know is powerful, but reinforced on the local level through governments, administrative tools, their narratives, what they say officially, and what their positions are related to Ukraine, to Georgia's membership in NATO, are in full line with Russia's propaganda in most of the cases, and it would be an exception if they have a different stance on anything really strategically important. So I would say to this question here, how to measure the success or failure of disinformation?
Monetize. It's not about measuring, it's about monetizing.
Yeah, well, how I see monetizing is actually, it's measuring whether you are successful or not. I might be wrong, I don't know. But it's, again, bouncing back to the influences. So if we're able to maintain high level of support of the Georgian population to its European, Euro-Atlantic integration course, to Ukraine, to its fight to Ukraine, well, that's the value in it for me. And it is, of course, closely linked to what the civil society does.
Thank you so much, and that proves that we need to support media, and civil society and the Western community have to look at it very carefully, not just support governments, but support civil society and media. That's the core of the democracy. Thank you so much. This is conclusion of our panel.
Thank you very much, Myroslava.